All right. Good morning to all of you, and welcome to the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University for those of you who are visitors. My name is Brandon Woodard, and I have the privilege of being the Director of Intercultural and International Student Affairs, or Student Services at our institutions. I'm really grateful that we have this time together this morning, and I'm really pleased to see this turnout. We didn't know what we would be expecting, and now I know what we should be expecting. At this point in time, though, I would like to ask a few things of you. First, if you have a cell phone, go ahead and put that on silent or vibrate, please, out of respect for those sitting around you as well as our presenter. I'd also like to encourage you to continue going to the events of today and this week. This day didn't just happen. This was the work of a lot of students, a lot of faculty and staff who wanted to help us do differently. I won't say better, but just do differently in regards to honoring the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. So I'm going to step aside and I'm going to turn it over to the interim president of St. John's University, Dr. Eugene Mcallister. Please welcome him.
Well, I'm going to be quick because you've got a lot of important speakers this morning and this afternoon. But I want to say welcome to St. John's and St. Benedict's commemoration of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I understand this is the first time classes have been dismissed, and I think that's terrific. So we ask the question, why are Catholic universities, St. John's and St. Benedict's, in rural Minnesota stopping classes today for a man who was killed nearly 50 years ago and whose most of his activities were in the South? Why should we mark this day? And I think there are three reasons. The first, this day is different. It's not like President's Day or Memorial Day or the 4th of July even, where we look backwards. Today is a day where we look forward, where we are going, where we should be going. And at the best, we are taking the ideals, principles, and belief of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and applying themselves to our community and our national life. And it's particularly fitting because we're universities. And universities may study history and things in the past, but universities are forward-looking. So today is a day for us to look forward. The second reason why this is very important is that Catholics and Reverend King was a Baptist minister, a theologian, share the most fundamental beliefs. Even more importantly, we share the same faith, which is not the same as belief. And people sometimes forget how deeply Reverend King spoke about and lived the Gospels. The things that we as Catholics believe, that Reverend King believed. We believed in a loving and personal God, the dignity of each person. We all have an obligation to help those less fortunate. The importance of living in community. And St. John's and St. Benedict students know that very well. And most importantly, solidarity among all people. These are not casual beliefs, but the most fundamental of beliefs. Beliefs that give our life meaning. And to sum it up, we and Reverend King and so many others believe that each of us is made in the image and likeness of God. That's why today is important. And the third reason, and it comes from Reverend King's letter from Birmingham jail, in which he chastised his fellow ministers, Caucasian ministers, for not speaking out, for not having the sense of urgency. And I read that letter and I said, I surely would have spoken out. But in some ways, I know I might not have. Because there's so many reasons not to speak out. We are comfortable Our friends don't speak out. The people we associate with don't speak out. So there's a lesson in the letter from Birmingham jail. And it's not just a lesson from the time when Reverend King wrote it, but it's a lesson for each of us. When do we speak out? When do we have the courage to stand up? When do we do what is right? So today is a very important day. I'm thrilled to see so many of you here today. I'd like to thank Brandon for pulling this wonderful schedule together. And today is a day for us to gather our courage, to summon our deepest beliefs, and be convinced that we can make a difference. So thank you all very much.
So, yep, I was going to ask, we've got a little more space on the sides a little bit here, and a little bit more in the front. And for one lucky person, there's a chair.
Hello, everyone. So today, on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we celebrate the life and legacy of someone who did so much to fight the injustices of his time. We celebrate someone brave enough to put his own needs second to the needs of those around him and the needs of his community, and continually fight for that community and those needs day in and day out. Martin Luther King Jr. accomplished so much, and it's important for us to recognize and commemorate those accomplishments while continuing the work that is still very much needed today. Our speaker today, Ricardo Levins Morales, is a great example of someone continuing the work. As a self-described healer, trickster, organizer disguised as an artist, he uses his platform and his talents to elevate social justice issues around him and fight for a better tomorrow. He was born into the anti-colonial movement in his native Puerto Rico and was drawn into activism in Chicago when he moved there at 11 years old. This activism work includes work with the Black Panthers and Young Lords, solidarity work with farmers, as well as various labor, environmental, peace, and racial justice movements. On his website, Morales says that he sees his art as a means to address individual, collective, and historical trauma. His mission goes beyond his art by leading workshops for activists and organizers. These workshops include topics such as trauma and resilience, creative organizing, social justice strategy, and sustainable activism. His work has been time and again put to use by grassroots movements and communities, which is a greater affirmation of his work than any award, although he's won plenty of those as well. I first heard of Ricardo Levins Morales last semester in a liberation theology class, where his work was showcased on the front of our Canvas page. The professor would change his art depending on the social justice topic we were studying. I was stunned at how many issues had a different accompanying piece of art. I mean, how many social justice issues was this guy actively involved in? I looked him up to learn more. I watched an interview he gave where he answered this question, and I was just as stunned by his answer. He says, "I have one issue, that's human resilience in the face of adversity." With that, I am grateful and honored to be standing here today introducing today's keynote speaker. So please help me in giving a warm CSB SJU welcome to Ricardo Levins Morales.
Okay, that pause was to make sure my mic had kicked in. Is it on? All right. So thank you. Muchísimas gracias por haberme invitado. I'm honored to be here. And this is a moment in which is set aside to look back and for the purposes of looking forward. And gatherings like this, when we think about our past, are not just a time to reflect on history, but they're an integral part of that history. That efforts to move forward are always based on understanding what came before, and often are rooted in struggles over the meaning of what came before. I was thinking about that on my way up here from Minneapolis, just sort of taking note of how many times driving up here I looked in the rearview mirror. That knowing what comes behind when driving is always important, but especially important when we have decisions to make, in order to make sure that we're making sound ones. So the present moment is always a downstream moment in the same story, in the same past. that we're honoring and looking back at. This fall, I had the extraordinary experience of having an exhibit up in a local workers' center of 50 years of movement history as seen through my art. What? 50 years? How'd that happen? Right? So it includes my first published pieces of work from when I was a teenage kid in 1968 and 1969. And we had it organized not as an event to say, oh, Ricardo is so cool, but really as a reflection of history. So we had one wall that was the 60s and 70s, one for the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and so forth. And what really struck me looking at that exhibit when we had it set up was how full all of those walls were. That from the time that Martin Luther King was assassinated, which is around the time that I entered social justice organizing, there has never been a day that has not been dense with organizing efforts and struggles for justice. Some of them under very different conditions, just like what we do in conditions of drought in my homeland versus conditions of rainy season. Downpour, the task's always different, but the work always goes on. And in times of political drought, we're preparing for the next rainy season. In times of political abundance, we're preparing for the next drought. So in this little pad, I have about 130 pounds worth of stories, which is about 3 days worth. So we'll see which ones we get to here. This is an old school tablet, right? This is what we used to do back in the day, right? When we organized without internets and GPS. Another thing I want to mention is that I'll pause from time to time because nobody ever taught me how to write legibly. So if there's you people are students, so some of you must have gotten that down by now. And if any of you feel like giving me some tips, I'm willing to stay around a little bit extra after today's event. So I became deeply involved in organizing when I was young, as I mentioned, not long after my family had moved here from Puerto Rico. And I'll be speaking today as somebody committed to that struggle. And for reasons that'll become clear, I can't imagine another kind of life than being engaged in trying to make things better. And I'll be speaking to you from that perspective. I understand that that's not necessarily a commitment that everyone in this room has made. Some of you are engaged in activism of some form. Some of you are engaged in activism just in your minds. Perhaps it's an aspiration. Some are you engaged in the activism of social media, which is usually more about aspiration than changing the course of history. And some may be actually rather resistant to some of the ideas. And I welcome all of you. And hopefully we can all learn something that will help us navigate the coming periods of instability in a more effective way. So I started out thinking about what it means to have this time set aside every year all around the country to reflect on King and his legacy. And it quickly morphed into, well, what would King be doing if he were here? One thing for sure is that he wouldn't be talking about his legacy, right? He'd be talking about, well, what is the situation we're facing and how do we move forward from here and how do we bring about a better world? And what he'd be seeing is something a little bit different than what he was seeing when he started his career in activism at the time of the Montgomery bus boycott. At that time, the political arc of the US empire had not yet reached its peak of global power. And it wouldn't reach that peak until a few years later in the early 70s, and it's been on the decline ever since. And now it is in a period of advanced decay. And that puts us at a pivotal turning point. King talked about the promissory note coming due, the invoice on the promise of equality and justice for all. And now we live in a moment where the ecological bill is coming due. And at the time when the era of the colonial era that spurred the economic war on the ecological systems of Earth has reached the end of its capacity to move forward and has reached the end of its credibility. And that makes the practice of truth-telling even more important than ever before, because we live in a moment when the lies of the empire are no longer believable to many people. That's why a rinky-dink police department like Ferguson, Missouri is awarded world-class military hardware. That's why the very idea of truth is being attacked, because it's very hard, if you approach the world from a truth-telling lens, to deny the fact that what we have been doing is actually undermining our ability to survive. And that very understanding is a threat to those whose only passion is the passion for profit. During the planning for the Poor People's March, one of those planning meetings in March of 1968, King's comrade-in-arms, Harry Belafonte, the calypso singer, reported that after talking about the achievements of the movement, King said, "But what deeply troubles me now is that for all the steps we've taken toward integration, I've come to believe that we are integrating into a burning house." And Belafonte says, "We had not heard Martin quite this way before. I felt as if our moorings were unhinging." "Damn, Martin, if that's what you think, what would you have us do?" I asked. He gave me a look. "I guess we're just going to have to become firemen." And I don't think he could have imagined really how prophetic he was at this moment in entering the 21st century. And it's a moment in which I draw most of my understandings of social change from ecology. I grew up in the forest. And it's a moment in which we need to shift, I believe, from the strategy that cattle pursue when an oncoming storm is coming versus the one that bison pursue. Cattle hunker down and huddle together and wait for the storm to pass. Bison charge straight into it in order to get over and through it sooner. And we have been trained for too long to exercise the cattle strategy, which is under certain circumstances not a bad strategy. But we come at a moment of precarious moment in history where I think we need to accumulate the courage to be bison instead, even though that means charging into uncertain ground and taking risks. Because the risk of simply waiting is becoming more and more clear that that is the greatest risk. So I came into the scene around the time that Martin Luther King departed from it. My family moved from Puerto Rico when I was 11 in 1967. King would be assassinated in Memphis the following year. And 1 year after that, I was drawn into activism, really by the assassination of a local black leader in Chicago where I was living, Fred Hampton and his friend Mark Clark, who were the leaders of the local Black Panther Party. Immigrating hit my family pretty hard. My mother started drinking at that time, as did I. I moved out of home at 15 and dropped out of high school a year later and had to figure out how to survive and get food to eat and hustle in every way that I could, improvising my way through the streets of Chicago. And I've come to believe that what really buffered me from many of the traumatic impacts of those experiences was that when I reached out, the way we all do, for some way to medicate myself against these blows, what I found was actual real medicine, which is to say, I was able to be held by the movements for social justice, which I encountered and in which I immersed myself. Movements that were explicitly about restoring power to people whose power had been taken away. And that, frankly, is the elevator definition of trauma healing. Trauma is about our power being taken away from us, our story being taken away from us, and healing is about restoring and restoring power so that we can continue our life, not as we had imagined it before, but at least in a way in which we're not captured and captive to the traumas that we've experienced. And that really has embedded in me a passion for organizing and healing as a single practice, because that's what I experienced. Not everybody, even in that generation, did. The struggle is hard in many ways as well as fulfilling. But it's what I experienced, and it's convinced me that if you are engaged in forms of organizing for a better world that are depleting you and exhausting you and making you run off and huddle in a corner to regenerate and heal, that the organizing is being done wrong, that it's not healthy, and that part of healing the world is in fact healing ourselves. We are the only instruments that can save the world from the challenges that face it, and so we need to be healing ourselves, not only to be able to move forward, but also to be able to be the citizens of a future healed world. That history is too full of movements that succeeded in throwing off one form of oppression only to imitate and replicate it, because that healing had never taken place. And that's something that we need to really, and that's something that really takes courage. And it really takes overcoming our passivity and overcoming our Minnesota nice and learning how to challenge each other in a way that is effective and welcoming. When I came into the movement, challenging somebody's beliefs and strategies and values in the course of struggle was a really good way to make friends. And now it's a good way to end friendships. And I think we need to restore that capacity to challenge each other in the interests of a greater cause. One of the things that I've encountered often, I'll run into women particularly, who I knew were involved in particular organizations, and I say, well, how's it going? And they say, well, I'm not doing that anymore. I had to leave. There were other things I needed to do, other priorities. And when I pressed them a little bit more, eventually the story came out, well, basically I was being treated like crap by the men in the organization. Or my ideas were either I was being harassed directly or hit on when in things that were supposed to be political one-on-ones, or my ideas were being dismissed and ignored or being appropriated by other people who took credit for it. And that is one of the actual major roadblocks that keeps movements from flourishing, is the acceptance within ourselves of oppressive practices in our struggle, whoever we are, to assert our own self-esteem, to assert our own status, to find ways to achieve well-being at the expense of each other and not of the system that needs to be eradicated. So healing and activism are really inseparable. It's interesting, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, a trauma theorist and practitioner, described once the difference in impact of the 9/11 attacks in New York City on the World Trade Center and the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And after 9/11, for all of its horror, there was relatively low incidence of PTSD, post-traumatic distress, whereas after Katrina there was much higher. And what happened is that in the case of New York, the people in the affected areas in the downtown of the cities ran. They walked for miles, back across the bridges, back to their own boroughs, back to their own safe havens in their own homes. That they did what a nervous system needs to do under attack. They took action. In the case of Katrina, they were corralled in limited spaces, packed like sardines into transports, taken to other cities where they were contained in stadiums and other places, and were not allowed that freedom to be able to take action on their own behalf, and PTSD was a major issue for people who survived. When Fred Hampton, the Panther leader, was killed in Chicago in 1969 on December 4th, I remember that morning I came down before going to school, and my father informed me that Fred had been murdered that morning. My father had already come back from the apartment where it took place, because the police in those days weren't smart enough to cordon off crime scenes and disturb and hide the evidence. And he was killed by a hit squad from the Chicago Police Department with support from the FBI. The head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, was a rabidly segregationist lawyer from Virginia who created the Bureau in his own image and was terrified more than anything of leaders, black leaders who could cross racial divides and build movements of solidarity, and Fred was certainly an example of that. But one of the reasons that they killed Chairman Fred was to frighten people away from the movement, and it had the opposite effect. That while that was a traumatic experience for many of us who witnessed that era, it was nonetheless in the context of a movement that had tremendous reservoirs of resilience. And so the effect of killing Chairman Fred led to a massive influx of new members into the Black Panthers and into the struggle, and I was part of that influx. Now, that period really left a major impression on me. At the time I came, the momentum of the Black freedom movement was shifting from the lands of the old Southern Confederacy and the slave system into the lands of the urban cities of the North. And the organizations that I had direct contact with influenced me more directly than the movements that had preceded them. Like any young person, I experienced the world as it was and did not have a great deal of historical perspective. But what left the deepest impact on me was the organizing effort that Fred Hampton led in Chicago, which he called the Rainbow Coalition. And that was an alliance he built between the Panthers, the Puerto Rican group called the Young Lords, and the Young Patriots, who were a white street gang with roots in the southern Appalachian migrant stream, who wore Confederate flags in their jackets and had family members in the Klan. And the Panthers, instead of figuring out how can we counter and isolate these enemies of the people, they asked a much more revealing question. They asked, why are these people hurting? And they came up with a unique and brilliant strategy to find out. They asked them. That's right. They asked permission to go and attend their meetings and speak. They went and shot pool in their pool halls. And what they found was that to the Chicago police, these kids were not white, they were hillbillies, just one shade up from dark, and were given the special police hospitality treatments accordingly, and that they lived in roach-infested and rat-infested apartments and had few job prospects. And from those understandings, they built a solid coalition that, I remember them creating, organizing protests together when anyone from any of the organizations was attacked by the police, joint marches around housing issues, joint hearings, public hearings around police brutality. And what's unique about this, and by the end, the Patriots dropped their Confederate flags and they organized health clinics and breakfast programs on the Panther model. And what's really stuck with me, and is deep in my organizer and artist DNA, is that they did not try to find middle ground. They did not try to build bridges. I'm not a big believer in building bridges. What they said is, it's not about compromising our narratives. It's about making clear that we have a better offer. Our vision has room for you, right? This is different from what Democratic Party pundits will always advise you. Find middle ground. Don't frighten away the white swing voters. But rather, the liberatory strategy is to say, actually, a vision of justice for poor people, for black people, for indigenous and other people of color is by its very nature a vision that includes everybody. It's the difference, whereas the vision being promoted by those who cater to a frightened white populace, still shaking from the impact of emancipation, the offer that's being made to white folks is about just us, as opposed to justice, which is deeply embedded in the liberatory narrative. Now I have to jettison about 100 pounds of stories here. So, as an artist, my work is to create narratives, is to tell stories, and to reflect stories. And the stories that I share are stories deeply embedded in other people's experiences. It's such an interesting thing. If you look at my art, I have an exhibit here downstairs. It will be up for the week. If you get a chance to look at those items that I brought here, you'll find that many of them are really the stories of other people's experiences. And yet, in all these years, nobody has challenged me and said, who the heck are you? How are you entitled to tell stories that aren't your own? And that's probably because I come from an era where identity was understood to be a stepping stone towards solidarity, where the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, and so forth organized on the basis of identity for the purpose of connection, because identity is what we need in order to be able to fight. Solidarity is what we need in order to be able to win, right? It was not strange at that time that I got recruited into the Black Student Union in my high school, where there weren't a lot of Latinos, right? And it wasn't because I was an honorary black, it was because it was understood that you build power through connection. That was before 40 years of the nonprofit system had turned identity into a brand to be defended and protected against the competitors, especially in the scramble for funding from foundations. So the stories that are reflected in my art are based in the struggles from below, in the grassroots struggles. They're really report cards on my relationships. Because if I'm going to be reflecting other people's stories, and I don't feel that I'm entitled to do so, I feel that I'm obligated to do so. As an artist and as a human, I need to reflect the stories of the world that I am part of. And if I make mistakes along the way, I'll hear about it, right? But only telling the stories of my own people is to pander to the siloing that has caused us so much trouble so far. There are three kinds of organizations that have been set up in the United States to channel people's aspirations for a better life, and at the same time prevent those aspirations from shaking the boat too much. Those are tribal governments, labor unions, and nonprofits. Each of them put into place at the end of a period of mass uprising in order to prevent those uprisings from continuing by providing an outlet, but not too much of an outlet. And it changed our relationships from horizontal to vertical, so that tribal government's primary relationship is with the federal government. Unions' primary relationship is with management, and nonprofits' relationship is with funders. And so our horizontal, our ability to see each other gets lost, our ability to be in solidarity gets lost. And yet when we look at what are the movements that are still shaking the ground, what are the struggles that have entered the stage of history just in the last few years, we find that none of them have come out of any of those organizations, or of the organized church for that matter. If we think of the labor uprising in Wisconsin, the Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, the Dreamers, Me Too, all of these have come from the wild country, outside of those fences of the official organizations. And many times those organizations can reflect and respond, but they're never where those movements and struggles come from. They're never from inside the safe havens that are funded and protected from the repression of the state. They're always from those places where risks are taken and new narratives are formed. So The art that I create, my approach to art is medicinal. I see its purpose as being to unleash the inherent power and healing capacity of people, of communities, of society. The organizing mantra that I follow is that the soil knows how to heal itself, the body knows how to heal itself, the community knows how to heal itself. But we are so bombarded by toxins in the form of chemicals, in the form of lies, in the form of dysfunction, that it scrambles our ability to see our way. So that there is a role for farmers and healers and organizers. But that role is to help protect us from the forces that prevent the activation of our inherent resilience, right? To counter lies with truth, to counter chemicals with nutrients. Okay. So, when I talk about truth, I want to kind of begin wrapping up here by framing a little differently the idea of what it is that we struggle for. And I mentioned that I come from the mountains, I come from the forest. The teacher that I had, my biggest teacher, was the natural world that I live in. It's a world of feedback loops. It's a world of replenishment and depletion, a world of lag times between when an egg is hatched and between an egg is laid and when it's hatched. And that's the lens that I bring to the movement. And much of the reading that I do is actually about ecology to inform my understandings. Recently, I was reading a book about insect navigation and came upon this fascinating quote from Stanley Hines, a neuroscientist who studies insect navigation. If we want to understand how to change the world, bugs aren't a bad starting place. Anything is a good starting place because we're so interconnected. But he said, and this is in his own professorial language, he said, one of the main functions of all brains is to take sensory information, use it to generate an estimate of the current state of the world, and then compare that to the desired state of the world. If the two don't match, compensatory action is initiated, which is what we call behavior. Right? What we call behavior. So that behavior is how we try to close the gap between what is and what we believe should be. Where does that come from? How is it that hamsters, butterflies, wasps, and humans have some kind of internal map? And really, its foundation is in our basic needs. We want food, we want shelter, we want safety, we want connection and companionship. We want to be able to follow our curiosity. We want the freedom to move. And that turns into struggles for rent control, for higher wages, for time off from work or school, and so forth. That the organizing campaigns are always based in those deeper selves, and that means that they're deeply based in truth. That the struggle for the future is not simply a battle between two different narratives. They're a battle between narratives based in our deeply human and organic truths, and narratives based in efforts to confuse, delude, and manipulate us. My father used to say that those who are fighting against justice, very few of them have an actual stake in injustice. Most have been confused, frightened, or bribed or manipulated into it. And finding those stories that are a bigger offer and a greater welcome has what I found been the only effective way to create polarizations in society that really bring the greatest family to our side. So if I were to organize a program for justice, I would require that any program we come up with be explainable by a second grader. The first plank in my program is nobody gets seconds until everyone has had firsts. That is profoundly revolutionary. That is incompatible with the system that we now live under, and yet it resonates with everybody who learned that as a child. Don't break things that you can't fix. Don't take things that are not yours to take, and so forth. The creation of that program is a collective process, but it's a better offer. It's a better offer, it's a deeper offer, it's a universal offer. That's the truth that's on our side. Frederick Douglass Well, before you say that, Martin Luther King's great impact and resounding impact is that, in fact, he refused to simply be in a struggle for just. One of the things he said in that same meeting was capitalism does not permit an even flow of economic resources. With this system, a small privileged few are rich beyond conscience, and all others are doomed to be poor at some level. That's the way the system works. And since we know that system will not change the rules, we are going to have to change the system, he said in March of '68 in that same meeting I referred to earlier. And taking that line got him exiled from respectable company, attacked by the elite, attacked by the media, and by many of his close friends and allies, whose real aspiration was to gain entry into the system and be able to, after so many centuries of exclusion, be able to reap the benefits of empire rather than dismantle it. And quite frankly, that was really the wing of the movement that produced and gave us President Obama. King, for very good reason, refused the invitation to run for president because he wanted to dismantle that empire, not to prove that people of color could be just as good stewards of empire as white people. But 100 years before that, almost exactly 100 years, Frederick Douglas, the most influential blogger of the 19th century, described the power of organizing on the basis of truth. Pandering to the prejudices of the swing voters of his day was something that he disparaged. He said, under this so-called practical wisdom and statesmanship, he said, referring to the liberals, we've had 60 years of compromising servility on the part of the North to the slave power in the South, and that has caused them to be more and more exacting, unreasonable, arrogant, and domineering. 60 years of such similar pandering to the slave power's heirs has given us President Trump. Frederick Douglass also said that truth may be careless and forgetful, but a lie can't afford to be either. Truth may repose on its inherent strength, but a falsehood rests for support on external props. Lies are deeply and fundamentally rooted in who we are as humans, as spirits, and as organic creatures in the family of life. Whereas the lies that manipulate us are like the naval sonar that confuses whales and prevents them navigating and finding their way home on their annual migrations and causes them to be beached on the beaches and not be able to find their way around the ocean. It's not that whales need to be taught how to find their way around. They have that in internal capacity. It's that they need to be shielded, protected from the lies and the assault that they experience. And given that opportunity, we can all find our way home. Thank you. So now we've got a few minutes, always too few, for you all to get a word in edgewise, ask some questions, share some thoughts, sing a song. I think there is a mic floating around that maybe will be able to reach you, otherwise you shout it out. But if you can use the mic, that's helpful, because especially there are many people who can only really hear effectively, oh, here it is, when there's a microphone being used.
Hi. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. So I was wondering when you said back.
Here, hold the mic closer.
Never hold one. Sorry. Wow. Okay. So back in the day when you said that people were not too offensive for their beliefs and perspectives to be challenged, I was wondering, was there ever a line that you guys never crossed? Was there ever something that you always made sure to respect about other people's beliefs? And if I were to try and challenge someone's beliefs nowadays, how would I go about that?
Well, I think there's a number of different approaches, and it's all based on context. So, for example, if you watch lion cubs or bear cubs, which I'm sure you all do whenever you have a chance, playing with each other, they're really playing out aggression. They're really learning how to hunt and how to defend themselves. and they're doing it playfully, but their claws are not extended because they don't want to hurt each other. But if they actually confront an enemy or a prey, they're going to have their claws out. So part of it is that we've lost the ability to distinguish when we're playing among ourselves to become better at what we do and when we're confronting enemies who actually want to kill us, right? So I think the approach is going to be different. My basic training as an activist, an organizer, and an artist was the fact that I had the opportunity or the requirement that I hitchhiked a lot when I was young. That's how I got around. I racked up about 26,000 miles and had to be in cars with people who had very, very different beliefs. And so sitting in a car with a white Army colonel who was paying back from when he was picked up as a GI, hitching home for leave, I had to figure out, well, where do I find a common layer, geological layer where we stand on common ground? And what I found out was that there were rarely any real differences in values, but profound differences in narratives. So he wanted to see his children grow up in a better world than he had grown up, and he wasn't seeing it happen. He was seeing the beliefs he held sacred being disparaged and abandoned. He was seeing his children not being able to make their mortgage payments and blaming that on immigrants, dark people, etc. He was seeing the moral values he was treated being threatened by queers and so forth, right? And so basically the value that he was operating from was the simple organic animal need for safety. And these toxic narratives were sending him down a path that caused him to be fighting against us. Now, that doesn't mean that we treat people like that in the context of conflict the same way that you and I would treat each other if we were disagreeing about strategy. Because when someone is shooting at you, that's not the time to say, oh, come on, let's sit down and have coffee, right? And also, I do not believe there's any requirement that we love our enemies. I think enemy is a useful concept. It's not inherent, but it's situational, right? We have situational enemies. But it's important to understand that if I don't love my enemy, it's not because they're not lovable. It's because I don't have the emotional capacity to deplete myself for that goal, right? That my primary responsibility is to take care of myself, to be an instrument of struggle. And so anyway, I hope that helps a little bit, right? But it's important for me to understand that they are traumatized, tricked, etc. Do we have time for one more question? Yeah, sorry, I answered too long there.
No, it's okay. What role do you think social media plays in activism, and does it influence it for the better or worse?
Both.
Could you get further into that?
Well, social media, one of the things that capitalism has done very effectively for several hundred years is turn everything it touches from a relationship into a transaction, right? And then try to use that transaction to extract wealth. So that when you and I sit down in a room together over coffee, I think I'm Puerto Rican, everything goes back to coffee. There's no outcome that we necessarily want. And we're communicating through eye contact, body language, tone of voice, body chemistry, odor, electromagnetic field, and so forth. And we're not looking for a goal, a payoff. When you tweet, you want it retweeted. When you post on Instagram, you want it liked. When you post on Facebook, you want it shared, right? When you send an email, you want to respond. So everything becomes a transaction. And that distances ourselves because we're not communicating on this deep relational way that we need to in order to be able to really identify with each other. So that solidarity is not just, I see that we have common interests, but when something hurts you, I feel the pain. That's real solidarity that can only happen through relationships. On the other hand, it's a tool that we could only have fantasized about, and we couldn't have back in the day because it allows certain kinds of communication to happen. And people like my sister, who suffers from multiple disabilities, is able to participate in communities of like-minded people and find real support, alliance, and share resources that would not have been possible without it. So like virtually everything in the world that we experience, it's made up of a combination, a deeply integrated combination of toxins and nutrients. And our job in any situation, any relationship, any social moment is to extract and highlight the nutrients as much as possible and try to not replicate the toxins. It's the same job that some of us have as parents. A wetland takes water that comes to it from upstream, filters out as many of the toxins as possible and passes cleaner water downstream. And that's really all of our jobs. It is not written that we must pass on the traumas the oppressive behaviors, et cetera, that we have inherited, or even what is handed to us by the technologies of our day, but to try to be aware of what is harmful and be aware of what is helpful and keep those distinctions clear as we choose our own behaviors. I think that's my deadline. Yeah. I'm always available for handwriting lessons.
Once again, I'd like to remind you that Ricardo's work is actually downstairs in the Great Hall for you to check out. And if I'm not mistaken, we're selling some of his calendars. Please remember that we have more teach-in sessions happening. Right after this one, we have President Hinton in this room. Then at 1 o'clock, we've got presentations in this room, 360 upstairs and 252 down the hall. Then at 4 o'clock, we will be at St. Ben's for the convocation. Thank you all for being here, and I'll see you soon.